For the past couple of weeks, we have been starting on this journey of creation spirituality, which is a way of thinking about God and spirit and all of that in a way that is more connected to the rhythms of nature than perhaps we have historically done in the West. And this is all based primarily on the writings of the 14th century German theologian, poet, professor, preacher, mystic, and all-around wonderful guy, Meister Eckhart. Anybody here read any Meister Eckhart? By the time you leave today, you will have. Like all good mystics, the Inquisition tried to shut him down. And like an absolute boss, he just died beforehand, and so they never nailed him. But recently, he has been vindicated. I think it was Pope Francis was cleared him of any wrongdoing in his theology. He's one of those people who taught that you didn't quite need the church, and that was very threatening for the church, I think. But he taught this way of spiritual growth that I find to be just so much truer to the reality of my own personal experience than the way we normally operate, right? Like we normally think about spiritual growth like you're climbing a mountain, you know, that you start at the bottom when you're born and you're trying to achieve some peak, some pinnacle, some height of enlightenment, right? Isn't that always on the mountaintop where like the sages and gurus are, where you're going up to get to them? You're going up to get to heaven, and you work, and it's hard, and it's strenuous, and it takes intentional work, because if you just decide to camp out at a plateau somewhere, you'll never grow. We even use words like backsliding, right, to talk about those times in our lives when we've fallen down, when we've gone backwards. And that may be a really nice way to think about it if you're one of those like overachiever type of person. And you like to think about everything as an accomplishment. But I have not found it to be very helpful in my own life. I have found that my own spirituality moves in cycles, in seasons, just like the seasons around me. And there are some seasons where everything seems dead and nothing grows, and it's just empty and void. And the old way of thinking about it would be a backwards slide, but I have found those are some of the most important times in my growth. So what I'm going to do instead, I'm going to do something different than I normally do, and I'm going to take you down this particular path that Meister Eckhart taught. Because he saw our spiritual growth less like a mountain and more like a spiral staircase, descending ever into the depths of the blessed unknown. That there are certain repeating patterns as we descend deeper and deeper into that great mystery. And identifying those patterns, those stages, those places where you might be is really helpful for you when you're in those stages. So as I explain these stages, I want you to keep in mind where you feel most connected right now, and then maybe we can have a little bit of conversation afterwards. But I'm also not going to use the sort of complicated theological Latin terms, because if I talk to you about the via negativa and the via transformata and the via creative, like none of that is very helpful, and I've got butterflies on the brain. So we're going to talk about it in terms of butterflies when they load. There we go. I want to introduce these steps as knowing, unknowing, transforming, and giving. Knowing, unknowing, transforming, and giving. In this first stage, this stage of knowing, everything is full of the glory of God. Everything is full of goodness. Meister Eckhart wrote, "Apprehend God in all things, for God is in all things. Every single creature is full of God and is a book about God. Every creature is a word of God. If I spent enough time with the tiniest creature, even a caterpillar, I would never have to prepare another sermon. So full of God is every creature." I'm going to do it anyway. "Earth cannot escape heaven, Flee it by going up or flee it by going down. Heaven still invades the earth, energizes it, makes it sacred. All hiding places reveal God. If you want to escape God, she runs into your lap. For God is at home. It is we who have gone out for a walk. This is a wonderful place to be, friends. When you walk outside and the glory of God is everywhere, when you go out to the garden and you see a caterpillar and you're like, your brain is blown open by the goodness and the smallness and the very care that goes into everything. Have you ever watched a butterfly walk? Did you know they have knees? Have you ever watched their knees move? Can you imagine something so infinitesimally small and beautiful as the knee of a butterfly? Do you know how butterflies know what is milkweed, by the way? They can see the patterns of the leaves, and then they land on them, and they taste them with their feet. And they can tell what milkweed feels like and tastes like with their feet, and they can tell if it's healthy, and that's where they lay their eggs. How glorious and wonderful is that? Some of you may be in this stage. Some of you may be walking around right now and just feeling full of bliss. You may have joined a new faith community like this one, and you are finding, oh, finally, I'm at home. I have found this new author, this new way of thinking, new way of being, and it is filling me with life. I am like a very hungry caterpillar who just eats and eats and eats and is never satisfied because everything is so overflowing with the glory and the goodness of God. If you're here, cherish it. It is so good. It is so wonderful. But chances are, after some time, you will find the edges of that. And no matter how much you eat, you will find the limits of your knowledge and those ways of thinking about God, of thinking about the world, of thinking about yourself, about family. You start to sort of feel a little uncomfortable. Have you ever watched a monarch butterfly, by the way, go through this process? They make this little J shape. You have, yeah. We watch this every year when we catch caterpillars. A moth will spin a cocoon around itself and then kind of, shimmy and change in there. A caterpillar changes from the inside. That chrysalis is starting to form on the inside, and it breaks out of itself and wiggles itself into this. There is a kind of unknowing that comes after knowing. This is one of my favorite lines from Meister Eckhart, by the way. I pray God to rid me of God. Pray that prayer sometime. I pray God to rid me of God. It's no wonder the Inquisition went after him. The highest and loftiest thing that one can let go of is to let go of God for the sake of God. God's exit is her entrance. I one time told a woman to stop coming to church. She came to me for pastoral counseling and was sharing with me a lot of the baggage that she still has from her father, who was a pastor and who was abusive, and how she comes to church and she loves parts of it. She loves the message, but she just ends up leaving feeling so icky. And I told her that church is getting in the way of God. You need to leave this version of God if you're going to find God. And so I gave her permission to leave the church, and I did not tell any of the elders that I did that, and she never came back again. But for her, she had to let go of God. She had to be rid of the God that she knew, because something in her had changed, like that caterpillar. Something within her had changed, and she could no longer deny it. She had found the edges, the borders, the boundaries, and was no longer finding life in this thing. And it almost sometimes feels like a waste. Like, why did I spend all that time in knowing if now I'm just going to have to go through this process of unknowing? Why am I going to have to now forget all the things that I learned? It seems like I could have maybe just started with ignorance and just lived in ignorance forever. But you cannot truly know what needs to be let go of until you have learned what it is to begin with. There is this process of eating all of the leaves so that you can then shed what you have become. Because even the notion of God is grounded in our notion of thingness, right? You cannot talk about God in a way that actually expresses God. God cannot be known or understood or experienced, and, only experienced, not known or understood. God can only be experienced. And that experience comes in its purest sense when you're not expecting anything. And if you're in this stage, it might feel like God is dying. It might feel like you're losing yourself. It might feel like you're losing the joy that you once knew. You might be afraid of losing your community, losing your family, losing everything you have ever known about yourself, about God. Your very foundation might feel like it's shaking, but it is a necessary dying. Because your knowing has made you bigger, and now your unknowing will make you new. So after this process of unknowing, for those who push through it, who push through the fear, who acknowledge that they no longer fit in the body they once had, there's a process of transforming. And to this, Meister Eckhart plays around a lot with the images of birth. He says, for all eternity, God lies on a maternity bed, giving birth. The essence of God is birthing. Does your heart suffer? Do the hearts of those around you suffer? Then you are not yet a mother. You are still on the way to giving birth. You are only near to birth. When the caterpillar goes into this stage, by the way, it's not just like a changing room where they're putting on wings and growing and whatnot. They are digested in that chrysalis. If you were to heartlessly cut that open, it would just be a kind of goo that pours out. There is nothing new that goes into that chrysalis. Everything that is in there started in there. It is just completely melted down and reformed into something different. This is a frightening time. I imagine if there was any consciousness in that chrysalis, this would be frightening for them too. But spiritually speaking, this can be a really frightening time because you don't know what's going to come out the other side. But it can also be a really creative time. This is the stage that Meister Eckhart calls the via creativa, or the creative way. He reframes this time, this place, as not a time of fear and sorrow and anxiety, but one of potential, one of creativity. Because once you have let go and have fallen into the eternal unknowing, God can be birthed through you, and you can be changed in the process. And I love this metaphor of birth that he keeps using. As somebody who has never birthed a human before and lacks the essential hardware to do so, I have seen people be birthed before. And I have seen the power and the passion in the act of birthing. I saw my wife and her pain and her fear. And there were times that she told me that she couldn't do it. But we both know full well that there was no going back. And that she was absolutely going to do this. Likewise, there are people in this spiritual stage who in fear and pain will try to retreat to an earlier stage. They will try to put the genie back in the bottle, as it were, and say, you know what? I'm done with this. I'm going back. I'm finding a good church with good music so I don't have to think anymore and I can just feel good again. I want to go back to a simpler time, to a simpler faith. Maybe I just need to be distracted again. They will try to retreat to a previous step, but you will find it impossible to do so. When you are in this step, the only option is to go through. The only option is to continue through this birthing process, to push through the pain, because on the other side of this birthing, this creative process, new life is born, both for the child and for the mother. For the one who has birthed the child is now changed, has now become different. Both are made new in this process. And the final step, giving. As Meister Eckhart puts it, at every deed, however puny, that results in justice, God is made glad, glad through and through. At such a time, there is nothing in the core of the Godhead that is not tickled through and through, and that does not dance for joy. The final step, friends, is giving. When a person comes through that transformation, they have become like God in the process. And the world just looks different. They see the world as God sees it. And in that outpouring of love, they must care for God's beloved in the way that God does. And that looks like fighting for justice because you have to, not because you want to or think you should. Because your every cell of your body is now geared towards that, towards justice, towards compassion, towards forgiveness, towards generosity, towards love. Just as the butterfly emerges, and I don't know if any of you have been there when a butterfly emerges, once their wings have dried for about an hour, they're gone. They're gone. They stretch these wings and they know immediately what to do with them. And they fly up onto the wind, and just like a plastic bag being thrown around the way that they do, they find a place to sit. They start finding flowers. They start giving back. They start pollinating. They start moving. They cannot help but move outward once they have come out of that chrysalis. And just likewise, we cannot help once we have gone through this transforming process, in whatever it looks like when it comes out the other side, when we have found that unitive experience with the living God, we cannot help but then fight for justice, for goodness, for God's world here on earth. And that leads us to the end of this beautiful, pleasant, and joyful and familiar path, as he says. The path of which I have spoken is beautiful and pleasant and joyful and familiar. I love that, familiar. It's like one that we all go through, but haven't named. Let whoever has found this way seek no other, and you shall find that God, who is whole and entire, will possess you whole and entire. And now, having gone through these 4 stages, we don't find ourselves at the top of a mountain, but rather we find ourselves back at the first stage, being enthralled and seeing the world filled with goodness and joy and overflowing with the presence of God, except now we are one floor lower than we were before. If this were school, we had just gone through Spirituality 101, and now we're in 201. The subject matter may be more advanced, but the steps are exactly the same. And hopefully, having gone through it the first time and having identified it as all good and all a part of the process, even the darkness, even the pain, the shame, the fear, the anxiety, the unknowing, the undoing, the unraveling, all of it being good and being a part of the process. Having gone through it, now that you are in Spirituality 201, even though those times may seem frightening, even though you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you know, because you have walked that path before, that there is life on the other side of that. That though this birthing process feels particularly painful, you know that if you push through it, that there is transformation for you on the other side. And so every time you complete this cycle, this 4-fold path, and go further and further down this spiral staircase into the infinite mystery, the next time it becomes easier, the surrender more natural, the unknowing more willing. The fear and the pain will be lessened the next time through, because you remember that they were the gateway through which you emerged last time. Knowing, unknowing, transforming, and giving. If you feel comfortable, where do you feel like you have been spending your time recently?